Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the book.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, SHERI HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on June 7th, 2024 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. Before we get into this week's Astro news you can use, my usual quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution, and that a new show drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern on most major podcast platforms. I wanted to tell you first that there is an upcoming podcast on which I have been invited to be a guest, and this is a podcast called New Horizons Podcast with a panel of professional astrologers that's going to air on YouTube on June 15th at 1 p.m. So that's next weekend, and I just wanted to let everybody know. I'll give you more detailed information next week, but we're going to be talking about the summer solstice. There'll be 4 of us professional astrologers, and we will all give our take on the upcoming summer solstice that occurs on June 20th when the sun enters Cancer, marks the beginning of summer in the northern western hemispheres at 1:51 p.m. in Pacific time and 4:51 p.m. Eastern time. So again, that's June 15th at 1 p.m. Mark your calendars, keep it in mind if you're interested in more astrology about specifically that next quarter of the year, where, traditional and mundane astrologers have long predicted what the season's going to be like based on the equinox and solstice charts. And also, I want to announce that I will once again be giving a lecture for Astrology Arizona, and that will take place on Saturday, June 22nd at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, and the other hours in between. And this is a talk I've already given for the Astrological Society of Princeton and at Astro Bash last fall, but I'm hoping that some of you who did not attend that may be interested in this. And the talk is titled "The Fight for Women's Equality in America, the History of the U.S. Sibley Chart's Chiron Return, Women's Rights, and the 2024 U.S. Presidential Election." And forgive me if some of you have heard this before, but I'm going to reiterate the description at least briefly. At its founding, America's laws did not include women in their concept of equality. From Abigail Adams' 1776 plea to her husband John Adams, "Don't forget the ladies," to the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision on June 24, 2022, learn how the triggering of the U.S. natal Sibley Chart's natal Chiron configuration illustrates this nation's long history of the fight for women's rights. This talk will first delineate the deeper meaning of these natal Chiron aspects in the Sibley chart and the nation's history of woundedness related to equality in partnership. This lecture then explores the incremental historical gains and setbacks for women's rights made during each of the first 4 U.S. Chiron returns, culminating with the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973. The fight for women's equality became an issue yet again when transiting Chiron in the 4th house first squared the U.S. Sibley's 7th house Cancer Sun on April 18, 2022, approximately 2 months before the U.S. Supreme Court's infamous June 24, 2022 Dobbs decision restricting women's rights. At that time, transiting Chiron once again triggered that the U.S. natal sun's Cancer Sun's T-square to its 10th house Libra Saturn, which is conjoined to Juno, the goddess of partnership, often referred to in traditional astrology as the wife, which oppose its 4th house Aries Chiron. So the question now becomes what to expect as transiting Chiron retrogrades back and forth, continuing to activate this natal T-square between now and February 18th, 2025. I would note also that Chiron is at 20 degrees Aries and that we took the April 8th solar eclipse to 19 degrees, 24 minutes of Aries. So we will discuss that as well. And, so if you can join us, please do. And if you'd like to register for this webinar, you can go to, hold on, let me see, AZ, that's for AZ for Arizona, azastrologers.org/donate, and it is $10 for members of that group and $15 for non-members. So I do hope that some of you at least are interested in women's rights and the future of our rights in America and astrology. So by all means, please join me on that date. And finally, I'm offering still my discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, which is a discounted rate for podcast listeners only. If you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about why you're here, what's your soul's true mission and purpose, and what might be holding you back from achieving your highest destiny in this lifetime, then this reading is for you. I'm not going to go into it in more detail to save space and time for the rest of this podcast, but you can easily find this offer and take advantage of it at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. It's actually slash. I get so confused between backslash and slash. It's a slash, not a backslash. karmicevolution.com/karmic125. And if you have any questions about the reading, please feel free to email me at SHERI, which is SHERI, at karmicevolution.com. All right, so now let's get into this week's Astro news you can use. And let's start, before we get into the greater meaning of yesterday's June 6th Gemini New Moon, where everybody wants to look ahead, let's first discuss the repercussions of the Taurus New Moon monthly lunar cycle, which began on May 7th and had both luminaries separating from a sextile to Saturn in Pisces and approaching conjunctions to both Uranus and Jupiter in Taurus. And I'm doing this because I think it's so important that we understand how one cycle leads to another. Astrology is the study of cycles, as well as how some momentous things actually happened that fit the theme of this Taurus New Moon this past month. And as a result, that can help us better understand what's to come in the new Gemini New Moon monthly lunar cycle. So the Taurus New Moon told us, or so it would seem to make sense now in hindsight, to plant seeds of greater stability designed to lead us to solidify and maintain our relationship to our most basic values. It asked us as well to reconfirm our commitment to Venus-ruled Taurus's most serious archetypal meaning, which is that of the feminine divine and reverence for her natural cycles. Now, the Sun's conjunction to Uranus on May 13th occurred 2 days before the May 15th waxing first quarter square of the fixed square of the Leo moon to the Taurus sun, which called us again not only to maintain our basic values, but also to realize we need to make changes to those no longer relevant to modern times and our current lives. Now, Uranus, known in psychological astrology as the planet of individuation, or the process of becoming exactly who our soul came here to be, aligned with the symbol of our ego persona, meaning the sun. The sun represents our basic core personality, provided us the opportunity to change our perspective about what we previously thought we valued most. And Venus then entered Taurus on May 15th. Mercury in Taurus squared Pluto in Aquarius May 17th, and then Venus likewise conjoined Uranus on May 18th, the same day the Sun conjoined Jupiter in Taurus too. So since Venus rules the Sun and Jupiter when they're in Taurus, this aspect represented an expansion of our values, particularly as they relate not only to reverence for the feminine divine's natural cycles of life, but also our relationships and our finances to a higher level of enlightenment. Therefore, the Venus-Saturn sextile May 13th told us to continue to commit to, read, grow into, plant seeds, grow into, our newfound change in perspectives about how we value people and situations, thus echoing the major theme of both luminaries' sextiles to Saturn as they approach conjunctions to both Uranus and Jupiter at the May 7th Taurus New Moon. By the time Mercury in Taurus formed a fixed square to Pluto in Aquarius May 17th, and here I think it's fair to use the recent Trump hush money election interference trial to illustrate those waxing days of the Taurus New Moon monthly lunar cycle. And we might note that it was between May 14th and 17th, as this aspect waxed in strength, that Michael Cohen, Trump's former fixer lawyer, took the witness stand to testify for the prosecution against Donald Trump at trial. Now, there's plenty of information out there on the details of this verdict, but my purpose is to track the timing of this event as it related to the Taurus New Moon monthly cycle. Now, you guys will have to forgive me because there was so much information coming so fast last week that processing it and processing what was going to happen and, on my home front, having some issues here, I had to skip the podcast last week. So I apologize for that. And I hope that you don't find it too tedious to go back and review some of this stuff because, again, I think it was quite momentous in terms of the Taurus New Moon cycles and the whole monthly lunar cycles messages about the worth of the feminine divine, all right? So as Mercury waxed into its exact square to Pluto, which happened on May 17th, but between the time that Michael Cohen started testifying, there was this was reported on the PBS NewsHour that day. Trump's defense attorney, Todd Blanche, continued to try to coerce the opinions of others against Cohen by trying to prove that he, quote, cannot be trusted and is a fundamentally untruthful, dishonest, and unscrupulous witness in this case. Now, if you ask me, you can't get a better illustration of Mercury square Pluto or this aspect than by watching Blanche trying to convince the jury by discrediting a witness. But what happened then was that by the time Venus and the Sun both conjoined Jupiter in Taurus on May 18th, which was followed by the Sun's sextile to Neptune in Pisces May 18th or 19th, depending on your actual time zone, it became clear that the Mercury-Pluto square actually was cautioning us not to become obsessed with forcing our ideas onto others to the point of exaggerating them so much that people might begin to have greater sympathy for those we were trying to malign. Clearly, since we know the outcome was that a jury found Donald Trump guilty of all 34 felony charges, the 12 jurors had more sympathy or empathy for Cohen based on his honest admittance of his former ties than they did than they resonated to Blanche's obsession. Mercury square Pluto is obsessive thinking to paint him as the criminal here. And that's especially true because Cohen had already done time in prison for the same crime of which Trump was being accused. What's most interesting to me about this is that the whole case, which really didn't center on the sexual liaison between Donald Trump and porn star Stormy Daniels, who prefers to go by her real name Stephanie Clifford now, so I will do that, but rather the fact that Trump paid her to keep quiet about it after the Access Hollywood tape was released so close to the November 2016 election date that it also had Trump's defense team put on trial a woman who made porn. So what I want to point out, and again, why I think this is so momentous, I can't stress that enough, Maybe it's because I'm a Taurus sun, I don't know. But, I want to point out that this trial happened during the Taurus New Moon monthly lunar cycle, and that the fixed earthy Taurus archetype represents how we value the physical body, particularly the female physical body, and the cycles of the feminine divine, as noted, of which both sexuality and fertility are a part. Now, since the trial's verdict, and more on that in a minute, I heard one legal pundit say something that resonated, so I wanted to repeat it here. And that is that she said that in the Trump's defense team's handling of its inquisition of Stephanie Clifford, it was as though we were still living in pre-#MeToo era, when women, such as rape victims, sexual abuse victims, physical abuse, were, and particularly also, prostitutes and all that, were treated like prostitutes or treated like whores, And here we have a case where they're also trying to paint her as a liar, as they did with Michael Cohen, mostly because she'd signed a non-disclosure agreement in order to receive the $130,000 hush money, and that she did that, and because of that, she initially denied that the two had sex. My point, again, that values have changed so much over recent years, including since the Me Too movement, which began circa 2017 when Chiron entered Aries, urging victims to speak out, and in 2018 as Uranus entered Taurus, calling us to change our values, particularly by reminding us to go back to revering the feminine divine rather than denigrating it. And that it was during last month's Taurus New Moon cycle that this point was brought home when a porn star's testimony helped create a factual account of a former president's blackmail or blackmailing her to keep her mouth shut. So here we have introduced again to the Taurus archetypal theme of money, as in how much is it worth to you to keep quiet? When keeping quiet is something women traditionally were supposed to do about so many things, not the least of which were sexual abuse and rape. So just as a reminder, it was the Me Too era that saw the conviction of sexual predator Harvey Weinstein, and that led us all the way to the former president's conviction of sexual abuse in the E. Jean Carroll case. Now, some of you may know that Harvey Weinstein had one of his convictions thrown out based on a certain kind of bias in the trial with witnesses, but they are going to retry him, and he is still in jail because he was already tried and convicted of sexual abuse in L.A. Of another actress. So, just making that point. But with E. Jean Carroll, Trump's disdain for women is such that, of course, he got tried twice. The first time found guilty of sexual abuse and defamation, and then when he defamed her again the day after, he received a whopping $83 million fine, which was imposed upon him for continuing to defame her after he'd already been convicted of it once. So back to Trump's recent trial. And again, there's a lot more happening this Taurus New Moon also. I just don't have time to go into most of it. I will try to mention a few things, but without going into them in great detail, just because my Virgo rising likes to be thorough, but I can't promise, that that's the case. There's just been I found there's so much information coming at us, particularly this past week and a half since the verdict came down. And there'll be plenty of time to talk about it, especially, since the Gemini New Moon just happened and we got, almost another month of time with a lot of planets in Gemini. So when the sun entered mutable, chatty, curious Gemini on May 20th and trined Pluto in Aquarius on May 22nd, the defense lawyers in Trump's trial tried to distract jurors from the more Jupiter-ruled Sagittarian big picture. But the prosecution continued to make its case through logic and facts and convincing jurors ultimately to use their common sense. Now, given that this trial, and I'm a former New Yorker, so given that this trial was made up of a jury of Trump's New York City peers, telling New Yorkers to use their common sense is tantamount to saying, okay, let's cut through the bullshit and get straight to the point. The guy did it, and here's how, and here's why. Now, New Yorkers are not the types of people to stand at a light and wait for it to turn green so they can cross the street when there are, in fact, no cars coming in either direction. In short, that Sun-Pluto trine empowered them to cut through the BS and to cross the damn street already. You don't need to stand there if there's no cars coming in either direction, which tourists do, people from out of town do, and some New Yorkers do. But, hardened New Yorkers are like, why are you standing there? Let's cross the street already. Nobody's coming. Nobody's going to hit you. What are you worried about? Use your common sense, right? So by the time Venus completed her conjunction to Jupiter in Taurus, and then her trine to Neptune early on May 23rd, sorry, that wasn't a trine, that was a sextile. So she conjoined Jupiter in Taurus and then sextiled Neptune. We experienced the Sagittarius full moon that day. As the Sagittarius moon reflected the light of the Gemini sun back onto itself, which is what all full moons do, it revealed the shadow side of the Geminian archetype, which includes superficial information and the use of tactics rather than overall strategies that might actually achieve the final goal of this Taurus new moon cycle, which, because its waxing portion involved the sun's sextile to Saturn and conjunctions to Uranus and Jupiter, was to plant seeds that solidify our our true inherent sense of moral and ethical justice, as I noted. I can't stress that enough, right? Jupiter and Taurus, it's like to thine own self be true, almost in a sense. It's not quite as deep as a Plutonic Venus kind of aspect or a Saturn Pluto. That's completely different. But it is very much like saying, look, where is your sense of moral justice and can you commit to it? And that, I think, is what this jury did. But anyway, as the mid-month lunar cycle peaked with the Sagittarius full moon, we were called to release any shallow, superficial information that we or others might broadcast. Gemini likes to spread information, but not necessarily fact-check it. There's nothing against Gemini. We're talking about his shadow side, right? He likes to pass information, but doesn't necessarily analyze it like Mercury's other rulership of Virgo does. So we also had the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Taurus at this full moon, which in hindsight now, again, would appear to be another call to enhance our commitment to justice based on our concrete, reality-based set of values around sexuality and the female body. And on May 25th, as the monthly lunar cycle began to wane post-Sag full moon, Jupiter entered Gemini, something about which I spoke on the last podcast. Now, Jupiter will be in Gemini for approximately another year, which signals many things, depending on where it falls in everyone's chart. But the dark side of this particular mutable energy is an expansion of all things shadow side Gemini, such as gossip and innuendo, he said, she said, fickleness in relationships, and spreading of non-factual mis- and disinformation and propaganda, and the use again of tactics without any sense of an overall plan, goal, or long-term strategy. I talked about this on the last podcast. On May 29th, there was also a Mars-Chiron conjunction in Aries and the third quarter waning lunar square, which asked us to continue to release our attachment to any confusion between illusion and fact. So when the third quarter monthly lunar square of the Pisces moon to the Gemini sun perfected, it was May, the Mars-Chiron conjunction was May 29th, and the third quarter lunar square occurred on the 30th, early that day, 10:13 a.m. Pacific time and 1:13 p.m. Eastern time. Now let's remember that it was only a few hours later, after only 10 hours altogether, which started on the 29th, the afternoon, and into the late afternoon on the 30th, that Donald Trump was found guilty on all 39 felony counts by a jury of his New York City peers, as we all now know. So remember, Trump was born and raised in Queens, New York, and resided in Manhattan until he moved to Florida in September 2019 during his presidency. And that is why the case was tried in New York City, because that was his residence at the time the blackmail and election interference occurred back in 2016. So also, late on May 30th, meaning it was waxing during the final day of jury deliberations, Mercury conjoined Uranus and Taurus at 10:54 p.m. Pacific time, and on May 31st at 1:54 a.m. Eastern time, an aspect that I had in my notes. I had written this, and because I didn't record last week, this is the first time I'm saying it, but I had written in my notes that this aspect could manifest as, quote, a surprise announcement. So looking again, and this is not rocket science if you're an astrologer, right? So looking again at the nature of Taurus, given the overall meaning of this monthly lunation, it would seem logical to conclude that any announcements made would be based on that solidification of our true values, especially given Jupiter's involvement as the ruler of the mid-monthly lunar cycle Sagittarius full moon in the realm of justice and the law. So in other words, the Sagittarius moon also reminded the Gemini sun, hey, it's about the long game, dude, and that can go for both sides. Remember, astrology doesn't take sides. The sides taken, and I admit this freely, and I've done it in the past, that every single person on this earth has their own perspectives, and because of that, we have our own biases. You would not be listening to this podcast if you loved and adored Donald Trump or any of his minions, or racist, misogynist, etc., xenophobic followers. So, I freely admit, like I said, my bias here. But after this, we had the May 30th, 31st Mercury-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, and it brought this verdict, which shocked a lot of people. It did actually, for those of us who have a commitment to true moral and ethical sense of justice, right? I want to share something from a blog by Judith Cowell, who's a fellow astrologer and quite good, written back, some of you may know her, written back on August 18th, 2018, about Donald Trump's chart and the placement of the fixed star Regulus on his 29 Leo ascendant at his birth. Now, before I say that, I just want to reiterate, those of you who listen regularly know I've been going on and on and on, both for, off and on for months, about how transiting Pluto has been quincunxing his ascendant, and with Regulus on the ascendant, it's been quincunxing both, and that means to me, anyway, as an astrologer, that people are changing how they view him. Meanwhile, especially at this verdict, Uranus is on his midheaven. That means that Uranus, although it's going to station retrograde and move away from the midheaven back towards the ninth house before it stations direct again and goes over his midheaven, but we're seeing the beginning of a shock to his reputation out in the world, a sudden change, okay? So I thought that what Judith Carroll wrote corresponded with a lot of what I believe as an astrologer, only she, of course, put it more succinctly. So she titled her piece on August 18, 2018, when Trump was obviously still president, Will Regulus Assure the Destiny of Donald Trump? And she wrote back then, and I quote, "In the natal horoscope of Donald Trump, it has often been observed here and elsewhere that at the time baby Donnie was born, royal kingmaker star Regulus arose on the ascendant just after his natal Mars in the royal sign of Leo. The Mars rising signature we see each day through Trump's belligerence, brashness, impulsiveness, boastfulness, competitiveness, and street-fighting nature, which punches back at every slight, whether real or imagined. Now, it's often asserted that revenge is sweet, a handy reference to Trump's rising Regulus for all the royal stars of Persia, when linked to an individual's chart via planets or angles, contain great promise, but they also come with particular cautions when and if their energies are mishandled or their commands ignored. Of course, along with Regulus rising at Trump's 29 Leo ascendant, we also see sun god Apollo rising and expanding his ego, plus combative Mars, which adds hypersensitivity to his touchy emotions and an annoying me-first attitude. So what do we know about Regulus? As noted, this major historical star promises great success if revenge is avoided. And what if it isn't avoided, but is a regular part of a personality, such as we see in the actions and reactions of Donald Trump? Then all that has been gained will be taken away. A difficult destiny, certainly, but one that in Trump's case is self-inflicted. Yes, Leo, the lion, is the proud sign of rulership and the natural leader. Yet there are many ways of acting as leader, and the natural law of karma, reaping what's been sown, still applies to even the loftiest among us. Plus, as we so often like to say in America, no one is above the law. Well, in the form of Donald Trump as leader, we, the people, with the aid of the U.S. justice system, now have a great opportunity to prove it. We're waiting to see how earthly justice plays out for Mr. Trump and his comrades in arms. And if we consult ancient texts and mythologies concerning the stars of the Leo constellation and their early implications, we find that Regulus, the Watcher of the North, was linked to King Feridun, who once ruled the entire world. Similar to Zeus, Feridun is known as a good and great king, much as Trump wishes to appear to us now, and ruling the world appears to be on top of his personal agenda. For as Bernadette Brady's Book of Fixed Stars informs us, quote, Regulus indicates power and success, and so is active in the charts of successful people. But the higher this star takes a person, the more they must guard against revenge. Always strong and hot in nature, this star will make its presence felt in a chart. Much depends on how it connects to the chart, but its meaning will have to do with the striving for success and the potential for ambitions to be fulfilled. However, at the same time, it will suggest issues of revenge, always tempting and testing a person. If, out of anger or hurt, the person takes revenge, then as promised with all royal stars, there is a falling from grace. If revenge is taken, then there is a loss of what has been gained. This loss may be public or private. And Cowell continues, strong and hot, so is Mars rising in Leo with his red ties and red face, yelling a colorful tale. As for other astrological references to Regulus, Ptolemy gives the star in the heart of the lion a martial and expansive nature, like Mars and Jupiter, while Robson links it to, quote, destructiveness and violence, and to honor that is short-lived. Eberton is generous and gives Regulus royal properties and a noble mind, frankness, and courage, elusive qualities Mr. Trump seems to assume for himself. And Rigor basically agrees with Robson and adds that the star, quote, gives the ability to command and to be successful, but that any greatness suffers an eclipse. Might we agree, Cowell goes on, that this refers to the great American eclipse at 29 degrees Leo, which in August 2017 precisely eclipsed the natal ascendant and rising Regulus of the very vengeful Mr. Trump. Add to that the disruptive cosmic blink or wild card energies of his very own prenatal solar eclipse, Trump was born on an eclipse, with the themes of separations, endings, and unfortunate news, for it repeated on July 12, 2018 at 20 Cancer, conjoined starry Castor and perfected quite near his natal Saturn, planet of law, government, business, karmic loss, and accountability. And so for these and other reasons, Cowell concludes, when it comes to the karmic destiny of the retaliating Mr. Trump, I am your retribution, okay, that's my words, she says, whose troubles are so often self-created, my money's on the great and powerful Regulus. How about yours? Again, to me, this is a testimony or something for us to ponder about whether we have faith in astrological energies or not. I know the answer to that, and I do believe, and I have always believed, that Trump will be taking that fall from grace. And I do believe, as I said, Pluto's quincunx. Now, quincunx, yeah, it's known as a minor aspect. It means adjustment. But in a political situation, adjustment can have really serious repercussions, right? Oh, I adjusted my attitude about him. I thought he was a good guy, and now, I don't think so anymore. I'm not sure, but I don't think so, right? That's, it's not major to a lot of people, but when they go to vote at the polls, or, it may well be. So, now, after this verdict, the Sun squared Juno, the goddess asteroid of partnership. As I mentioned before, she's known in, Greek mythology as the wife, right? And that happened on May 31st, and then Venus followed with her square to Juno on June 1st, and that's when differing opinions began to emerge on what constitutes true justice, right? So the right is crying, the weaponization of the Justice Department, and the left is saying, no, we're like, just the facts, ma'am, and the jury did their job, and thank God for that, right? So continued commitment to individual beliefs about what constitutes justice, actual justice, were strengthened on June 2nd as Jupiter and Gemini formed an air trine to Pluto retrograde. But the caution here was that the money is not on trying to control others by forcing one's values onto them, but rather on striking a balance between what astrologer Rob Hand calls enlightened self-interest and the interests of the collective. So when Mercury sextiled Neptune June 2nd as well, it provided us all with hope that positive future change is not simply illusory wishful thinking, but rather entirely possible. And Mercury's entrance into Gemini June 3rd and trine to Pluto in Aquarius, either the 3rd or the 4th, depending again on your time zone, called us to strive to get to the bottom of things. For example, to learn the real story behind a multitude of superficial and potentially confusing details. And when the Sun conjoined Venus in Gemini June 4th, we looked to connect our ego persona with that of others through discussing our commitment to our now changing or read more up-to-date values. And on that day also, several different things were made, including those about, several different announcements were made, including those about both primaries and foreign elections and things to do with the law here. So in keeping with the overall Taurus New Moon theme, because these all occurred still at the waning portion of that lunar cycle, keeping with the overall theme of cementing true moral and ethical justice, or our sense of justice, into our DNA, on this day, Mexico proclaimed a new president. Well, it was actually June 2nd, but And Mexico just elected their first woman president ever. And, pundits are quick to point out, hello, America, you're behind the times. There are other females who have been president or prime ministers or whatever for years now, but not here. So again, we look to compare that to our traditional set of values and how they might be a little bit outdated, right? And in addition to electing their first woman president, and although I didn't see this publicized anywhere, which doesn't mean, of course, that it wasn't, it's just that I haven't seen it, she's a Jewish woman. Now, if that happened in the U.S., the first female president would have made headlines across the world, too. But I believe that the first woman president who was Jewish would have made the headlines also. To me, this is similar, and I was a child then, really small, when JFK was first elected, and the press made a big deal out of the fact that he was the first Catholic U.S. president. So I take the election by Mexicans as another underscoring of the meaning of the Taurus New Moon monthly lunar cycle, which is that at a time when states and elected GOP officials continue to prohibit life-saving medical assistance to women through restrictions on abortion and abortion care, the mailing of contraceptions, etc., the feminine divine still shines through. Just not here in America, where the traditional Saturnian types continue to resist the inevitability of future change and progress in alignment with changed circumstances and along with them changed values. So here's a recent headline from the New York Times on June 2nd, as we had the Jupiter-Pluto trine, the Mercury-Neptune sextile, and we're waxing toward the June Mercury-Pluto trine and the Sun-Venus conjunction in Taurus. So the New York Times headline read, Mexico elects Claudia Sheinbaum as first woman to lead country. A climate scientist and former mayor of Mexico City, Ms. Sheinbaum won a landslide victory in what was called the largest election in Mexico's history. And then there was this from Wikipedia. Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo was born to a secular Jewish family in Mexico City. Her paternal Ashkenazi grandparents emigrated from Lithuania to Mexico City in the 1920s, while her maternal Sephardic grandparents emigrated there from Sofia, Bulgaria in the early 1940s to escape the Holocaust. She celebrated all the Jewish holidays at her grandparents' homes. Both of her parents are scientists. Her mother, Annie Pardo Simo, is a biologist and professor emeritus of the Faculty of Sciences at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and her father, Carlos Sheinbaum Yoslowitz, was a chemical engineer, and her brother, Julio, a physicist. Let's just assume, then, that this is a woman who believes in the natural cycles of both the universe and of life, right? Speaking of which, and as mentioned, the natural cycles are a huge focus of astrology, and that when Mercury sextiled Neptune on June 2nd, which is when that Times article was printed, as well, it provided us all with hope that positive future change is not simply illusory wishful thinking, but rather entirely possible, right? So, since the Gemini New Moon yesterday on June 6th, which occurred at 5:38 a.m. Pacific Time and 8:38 a.m. Eastern Time, at 16 degrees and 18 minutes of Gemini, the both luminaries are also conjoined with Venus in Gemini, which to me is a repetition of the Taurus New Moon's message that now that we've planted our commitment to now that we've planted our commitment to reverence for the divine feminine as part of our foundational value system, part of our DNA, Mercury's separation from its June 4th conjunction to Jupiter in Gemini asked us to continue to communicate with each other, even though we're waxing toward the exact mutable squares of Venus and the Sun in Gemini to Saturn in Pisces, which will perfect on June 8th and 9th, respectively. And these squares bring to the forefront our doubts about a hopeful future. right? So one says have hope, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh man, I don't know. I'm listening to all this stuff and the polls and yada yada, and what's going to happen, and reading articles about how the Europeans are all like, oh no, we're bracing for Trump to win the election. That's what the polls are saying. This is sucks. And people like Michael Cohen, who I heard interviewed right after the maybe a few days after the verdict came down, he was like asked if he was afraid. And he's like, oh, I've been scouting out places to move to if Trump gets reelected, So anyway, these kinds of squares to Saturn bring to the forefront our doubts about a hopeful future. And that's especially true when Venus squares Saturn. It's about, who do I commit to? Who do I commit to? And when the Sun squares Saturn, it's like, well, do I go for self-gratification, or do I have to do the hard work? Like, do I got to take care of my obligations, or can I just go out and play, right? And same with Venus, only Venus, may involve more physical stuff, more stuff specific to relationships, and of course then to money commitments as well, or financial commitments. So what I'm trying to say, not to be repetitive, is that these squares bring to the forefront our doubts about a hopeful future, as Saturn in Pisces has illustrated that our old foundations may not hold if they're not sound. So think, Saturn is a earthy, right? Rules Capricorn. Saturn's represented by lead. It's like the heaviest metal you can get. You put lead stone in the water, it's going to sink to the bottom. So think foundational infrastructure and the destruction that we've seen since Saturn entered Pisces on March 7th of 2023, of the destruction of the bridges and dams, and then the infrastructure bill passed by the Biden administration to repair all these things, the roads, the bridges, the stuff that happened to the Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, that really was a worldwide news, right? So we may begin to feel with these squares to Saturn that things are crumbling beneath our feet. But as I've noted before, if you're on the water and you start to sink, you need to build a boat, because boat building metaphorically represents creating a solid foundation on ever-flowing, moving water. This is a good kind of thing to ask ourselves or to meditate on as we move into the early waxing portion of the Gemini New Moon cycle, right? We can ask ourselves this question: to what and to whom am I really committed, and why? We may need to spend some time alone to contemplate this, but also be wary of falling too deeply now into a sense of despair, isolation, loneliness, or depression. We may simply need to insert a bit more flexibility into our standards around relationships, both with ourselves and with others, especially since Mars enters Venus-ruled Taurus also on June 8th or early the 9th, depending on your time zone. This combination of archetypal energies may temper our feelings of doom and gloom, because it calls us to blend our masculine and feminine energies together in order to achieve a happy combination or reverence for both, through the knowledge that one cannot exist without the other. And it exhibits a renewed sense that we must take action if we are to preserve our values. Mars is the planet of action. This, of course, means for everyone, even those with disparate or conflicting sets of values. Now, again, astrology doesn't take, sides. So those who want to hold on to their old values will be more committed to do so, as we are seeing in the news right now, in America and the political side, right? Everybody's trying to now scramble because they're saying that Trump is not a convicted felon because the legal system was rigged, just like the election was rigged, and everybody's rigged, and anyone who loses will cry that it was rigged. The biggest problem my logical brain had after 2020, when Trump was planting the whole rigged election fraud BS, was that how come none of the other Republicans lost, right? Now, some of them did, but I'm saying any Republican who won an election, how can he claim that the election was rigged? Duh, Anyway, on June 11th, Venus will sextile wounded healer Chiron, which follows the Mercury Chiron and Mars Chiron conjunctions from May 6th and May 29th, respectively. Now, there's a lot inherent in that, and I've spoken about it because also at this new moon yesterday, we had Hygeia conjunct Chiron. Hygeia is the goddess asteroid of health, and Chiron is, has also been conjunct to Eris and Mars. This relates to something I did not talk about much in this podcast, but have spoken about a lot in the past, which is the situation in Israel and Gaza. So we'll get back to that next week, but, Hygeia, I talked about the Ceres, Hygeia square, I think it was, or Juno, I'm trying to remember now, Chiron, Hygeia, and Ceres has to do with food and sustenance, all right? This is still going on, all right? So people are starving in Gaza. Roads have closed. The bridge that the Americans built to, not bridge, but the dock that the Americans built to help deliver more aid from the sea, it blew apart or something last week also because of the high winds or some other, environmental conditions. They did subsequently fix it. There are a few days where, to me, this is Saturn in Pisces, right? It's like indicative of something failing. The foundation didn't hold, right? So they have to rebuild it. But anyway, June 11th is also the day that Mars in Taurus makes a waxing square to Pluto retrograde in Aquarius. And that's a synodic cycle that began in February. I think it was February 13th, but I have to check. And I talked about that on a past podcast. So we look at this in the context of collective events between then and now, including, right, because it happened right before Trump's verdict in the E. Jean Carroll trial. But I'm going to continue to track this because it's so important because, we've had prominent people in the news currently, along with the fact that the waxing Mars-Pluto cycle is going to form an exact opposition 2 days between the November 3rd presidential election. Now, Mercury squares Saturn on June 12th, meaning it's closely following Venus and the Sun squares just days before. Therefore, again, be aware that leading up to and through June 8th to June 12th, we may experience a few days of pessimistic thinking. However, we may also see some uptick when the Gemini Sun sextiles wounded healer Chiron late on June 12th or early on the 13th. Now, this may well highlight the dichotomy between the Virgo moon's conscious portion of our psyches that understands facts and perceptions and the need to connect through opportunities for greater health and healing as we experience the first quarter looning waxing square of the Virgo new moon to the Gemini sun on June 13th and 14th. And just a reminder that, again, the Gemini new moon is telling us to plant seeds of the positive things about Gemini, being able to listen, being able to communicate, being able to say what you think and feel and what you mean, and that, the shadow side, especially as these squares to Saturn start to occur, can introduce doubt about that. Are you hearing me? Are you listening to me? The shadow side of Gemini, of course, is for the other side to say, well, are you listening to me? Right? But we're not there yet. We're talking now about a new moon cycle where we want to plant seeds about reducing fickleness in relationship, right? Reducing insecurity or difficulty about expressing ourselves in relationships, along with the issues or tensions surrounding commitment, because these are the things that the squares are going to bring up during this early part, especially of the new monthly Gemini new moon cycle. And what is commitment in relationship based on in Gemini? Is it based on verbal agreements? And if so, are they binding? Now, in law, I know from my son who just graduated from law school that they are, but it depends on the circumstances. Will people's perceptions change, as they hopefully are since the verdict in the Trump trial? And I'm not going into it today because there's just not enough time. Recent events again in Gaza, recent events in Ukraine and Russia as they fight off their, people who are transgressing their borders. A lot of this stuff is happening, especially since I had a portion that I don't have time to discuss, but talking about the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction back in April of 2022, and that was that's the dissolution of laws, dissolution of boundaries, along with the fact that in 2023, in March, Saturn went into Pisces, right? So we can see this slow erosion of the foundations of so many things related to these archetypes. People are determining who they're going to vote for in the upcoming November presidential election in the U.S. based on the subject of immigration. And to me, I'm surprised that other astrologers don't so directly relate the concept of archetypal Jupiter and Sagittarius to the movement of people over borders because, Jupiter, they always talk about foreign travel, right? Well, what's more foreign, what's more travel that's foreign than trying to make your way out of a country and into another? And so as part of the announcement on June 4th also that the day that the Mercury conjoined Uranus, Uranus, I'm sorry, hold on. It was the Mercury conjoining Jupiter, right? That was on January 4th. President Biden also took executive action to limit the amount of people who can come across the U.S. border from the Mexican side and enter Texas and Arizona and California, because apparently now they're coming in greater numbers up through California as well. So he is putting a barrier there, right? We can agree with it or disagree with it, but again, my point is in talking about how the astrological energies are manifesting in the collective now. So we'll all stay tuned. I do have so much more that I wish I could talk about, but time is of the essence. And I do promise to be back with you next week. Things have been a little crazy here in my domestic front, so forgive me again for having been erratic and skipped a few podcasts. I will try not to do that in the future, at least until I go away for a week in early August, but when I'll just take a vacation day. But again, I digress. So thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Think about your values. Think about where you stand now, whether you're clinging to old ones as a result of the Taurus New Moon cycle, or if you have had any changes of heart about anything, any relationships or anything to do with finances or the other themes that we've discussed. And please be sure to join me again on next Friday on June 14th for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.